Hello, everybody, and welcome to Built to Lead. I'm Kate Ryder, the founder and CEO of Maven, the world's largest virtual clinic for women's and family health. Our event today celebrates Women's History Month by offering a candid conversation with 4 incredible engineers on navigating your career. It's a great group full of New York pride, as we've just been talking about in our backstage area. That includes an engineering manager who has never been an engineer, 2 experienced engineering managers who are currently in an IC role and can speak to the fact that careers are rarely a straight line, a mom who has written about how becoming a mom and a manager at the same time has made her better at both, and 4 women in tech who care deeply about diversity, equity, and inclusion and have generously given us their time today. So thank you so much to everybody who's here. We're so glad to have you. And so for our audience today, I hope that you can walk away today, first and foremost, inspired. So inspired to navigate your own career, regardless of your gender or management level in an industry that has been traditionally more male dominated. And, second, I hope you learned something. And so without further ado, let's get started. And when we're going through everything, please drop questions as you have them for the panelists in the chat function. I'll reserve time at the end for questions, but also if there's questions that come up after somebody answers something or tells a story, can also incorporate it during our run of show today. So let's start. Each panelist will briefly introduce themselves, and they're going to tell us, 1, how they got into engineering, and 2, what they like most about the engineering culture at their company. So Rachel, I'm just going to go around here. Rachel, why don't we start with you?
Sure. Hi, y'all. I'm Rachel. I use she, they pronouns. So currently I work at Figma. My path to engineering went through a bunch of hard sciences. When I was younger, I was doing like a lot of sort of pre-med classes for fun, a lot of math. So my route was through a computer science theory PhD, where I have a 80-page math proof about cryptography for my master's thesis. And I've really enjoyed some parts of that, but I sort of found in the depth of math, I was missing some connection of my work to people. So I ended up finding that through going to product engineering and just getting a deep appreciation for how my work was used by people and understanding how to best build something that met their needs. And then over time, I shifted more and more towards people in a past role. I've been an engineering manager, and I've really loved that combination of thinking about how people can build things, just like technical brain and people brain, love it together. Something I've loved at Figma already is just how many pieces of evidence that I've seen of people support. I think for me, it's always in the details of how you actually see that happen in practice. Some things I've really loved is just how much time I've seen people at Figma invest in creating fun together. One of my favorite examples is there's something called components, and someone has built a visual Mad Libs novel maker using this. So you can sort of build characters and then have someone else set the text and have them join together. And then also another reason I work there is I've really appreciated how that head of engineering talked to me about his personal involvement with D&I recruiting without me even having to ask. And just seeing actually like the fact that he knew the day-to-days of what was happening, that's something that was a part of his pitch, was something that really spoke to me too.
Amazing. Thank you, Rachel. So we're going to go around. Najla, you're next.
Hi, everyone. I'm Najla. I'm an engineering manager at Etsy. And the way I got into engineering is when I was 13. So okay, so the story is I was kind of bullied at this high school that I went to. And then I went into the school district and tried to find like loopholes to transfer high schools. And I found a computer science program at this other high school. So I applied, I got in, and then I moved to this other high school. And then and then I really loved it. And I did that. And then I majored in engineering in college, in computer science specifically. And yeah, I've been there. I've been in engineering ever since. And my favorite thing about Etsy's culture is probably the blamelessness. I think it's funny because like we all need to like know why things are happening and how we can hold people accountable for them and systems accountable for them. And being able to do that in a way that doesn't attribute blame to specific people or systems is really important. And it makes people like much more willing to talk about their mistakes and how to make things better. So that's definitely my favorite thing about Etsy so far.
Great. Tal.
Hey, I'm Tal. I caught a cold, so excuse the occasional cough. I work at Compass. I've been with Compass for around 5 years, a little over. Formerly an engineering manager, and now back to being an IC. How I got into engineering, when I was growing up in school, I was in a gifted class. So we were like smaller, we had a lot of enrichment. It was very cool and interesting. And it was kind of like a joke that everyone from our class would go on to like learn computers in university. And when I finished school and the army, because I'm Israeli, and you do that before you choose what you want to do as a profession, I was kind of sitting and thinking and said, okay, well, I have to choose what I'm going to learn. And actually, like, why not go into computer science? So I tried it. I tried some Visual Basic, and I thought it was really rad that you could build stuff and they just appear and work on the computer. And I went on to major in it. And it's an awesome profession that lets you just solve riddles all day, and it's great, and I really enjoy it. What I love most about Compass culture, I think that the thing we do best is, and this kind of resonates with what the others have said before me, we hire people that we want to work with. It's not just like they're very intelligent or very accomplished, or we just make sure that these are people that you would be excited to collaborate with in your team. And it's really hard to do that as your company like grows tremendously. We were talking before about hypergrowth. My company has gone through a bunch of hypergrowth. They've basically they're like 15 times the size that they were when I started. The consistent part is always that whenever I meet a Compass person, and this isn't just necessarily engineering, I know I'm going to have a good time talking to them. And that's like very rare to me. So that's what I enjoy most.
Great. And Ivy.
Hi, I'm Ivy Reyes. I'm a senior engineering manager at Maven Clinic. I got into engineering, when in college, I was actually a physical therapy major, or wanted to be a physical therapy major. But at the time, the university program was sort of not baked yet. So I thought, okay, I'll just take a few CS classes here and there. And I took some and I really loved it. I loved problem solving. I loved just everything about it. So I took more classes, enough for it to become my major. That, and then minored in mathematics and psychology, which are my personal interests. So I moved to become a backend engineer, and then eventually kind of moved on to management. So that's my transition. And what do I love about the Maven culture? So I joined Maven in the middle of the pandemic. And when I onboarded fully remotely. And I haven't met anyone at Maven face to face, but I still feel a connection with a bunch of Maven people. And I think just people put effort into getting to know each other. So just a few examples, like our meetings, we usually just have a few minutes to chat, about whatever, our weekend, interesting shows we've seen lately, good food we've had recently. We try to do team events, like anyone can just schedule them. We play Scribble. We recently had Escape the Room events, and went on virtual chocolate factory tours and virtual animal farms and virtual happy hours. So we try to just get to know each other. And I think when you have that level of getting to know each other, even when we haven't seen each other face to face, we're not at the office, we just get to know each other's kind of working styles and how we work well together and communicate better that way. So yeah, that's what I like.
I'm so excited. We're going to have an office soon.
Yes.
And I'll get to meet each other. Ivy, you and I can meet for the first time too.
Yay.
Great. So, okay. So This question is for, let's see, Rachel. Is there, or what's the biggest misconception about management that you often hear from individual contributors?
Something I really like to point out is that management versus IC is not as binary as it seems. I know there's whole different roles, and so it's tempting to think of them as totally split. But something I've appreciated more and more in my career is seeing how much influence just sort of coming from the IC side can have on making sure the people are set up to do the work. I really like it when you also get to sort of try out management and just sort of like bite-sized snacks before you go there. So I've liked thinking about like who are the people that need support? How can I sort of take all of the sort of process ideas for the team and make sure anybody knows that they can try that work and take that on too. And I think that's been really powerful, especially even personally for me right now. I'm getting so much from going back to being an IC and thinking about the technical work and the growing in that.
Great. So Najla, this one's for you. You mentioned a funny thing you read called "Your manager doesn't care about you," meaning that 90% of the time they're thinking about themselves and the remaining 10% of their attention is split between all of their direct reports. And so what should an IC take away from this?
Yeah, it sounds like a really harsh talk. And it sounds like, I guess it's not something I share with people to get me out of doing my job, I promise. But yeah, I think there's this misconception that like you go to your manager and they're going to listen to every word you say and they're going to fix your problem. And it just doesn't really happen that way, because what's actually happening is like you're going to a human being who has a lot of things to deal with, not only in their personal life, but at their jobs with all of their other reports and their other responsibilities. So yeah, you're just like one of the small things that they think about. So the takeaway, the reason I share that is because the takeaway is that we need to like care about ourselves first. Like you as an IC or as a manager with another manager, you need to prioritize yourself and figure out how to grow your own career, and then figure out the bite-sized ways that you can leverage your manager to help you get there, as opposed to telling them, well, I want to get promoted, and then like leaving it there. So like going and doing the work on your own, and then coming to your manager with the context that they don't have a full-time job of taking care of you.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. Great. Well, and so Tal, another book that you were talking about is Radical Candor, and how it has had an outsized impact on your leadership style, and has made you more intentional about how you approach the relationship with your team. And so can you say a little bit more about what shifted for you after you read the book?
Yeah, when I made the decision to go into management, I mean, there weren't really any like, the training was extremely basic. It was more logistics. And I felt like I needed a little bit more guidance into like what I'm supposed to be doing and how. And I heard a recommendation about Radical Candor, and it was like life altering, big, like huge recommendation to anyone listening. But basically my main takeaways from it is, first off, like the benefit of being direct, which as an Israeli, like I mentioned, comes pretty easily to me. But so I always like pull the Israeli card when I want to be direct with someone. Now I don't have to, because I can pull the Radical Candor card. But yeah, basically like knowing that you're doing people a disservice if you're not being straightforward, and also the immediacy of feedback I've found to be like very good actionable advice, to just always give feedback immediately. Nobody should be surprised during their review conversations. Everything should sort of be flat out talked about during one-on-ones. And so reviews are just a way to sort of cement a moment in time, but they're not like, oh, you're doing great, you're doing great. By the way, here's a huge thing that I haven't told you in 6 months. So yeah, I kind of felt like I needed some structure around those conversations. So I introduced into my one-on-ones a growth plan. Basically sat down, wrote out a template, figured out kind of with some guidance from Radical Candor around that chapter, what I wanted them to think about beyond just our meetings. And so we talked about long-term plans, and we talked about how their aspirations for their lives coincide with what we're doing at Compass, and how we can work on the skills that they need within their work. So we feel like they're working towards something and not just working. And that, that long-term view, along with the intentionality of our meetings and knowing what we're going to be discussing, has really like made them a lot more focused and a lot more intentional in how they're spending their time. So I always felt like I wouldn't know what to do without these plans.
Great. And Ivy, you've talked a little bit about the rubber ducky approach to management, meaning that sometimes your direct reports just need space to talk and work out their problems. And I'm sure that has just been totally amplified during the pandemic. How did you come to this conclusion? And does that, so first would love to hear that.
Yeah, so I'm not a talker to begin with. Like, I feel like I don't always have the answers, but even more so, I think sometimes, especially for engineers, they just want a sounding board. So they want to talk and kind of process their thoughts, process their feelings, and then I'll ask questions, when needed, and help clarify their thoughts. I think an example, I come across these situations where an IC who's really torn between going into the more technical direction versus going into management. And I could see them being very good at both. Either way, I cannot help them unless they process what they really want to do. Why do they want to become a manager, or why do they want to become more technical and IC, right? I can't help them with that. So I listen, I talk to them, I ask them questions, and usually they come up with an answer themselves, because again, that's not something that I can help them with, so yeah.
And so, what's that?
Something I really have liked on top of rubber ducky approach, I've been really getting into taking notes the past few years as something that just makes it really easier to feel totally heard in a conversation too. Like I found it, for example, like when I'm having a difficult conversation with somebody, it's really nice to write down like what all the challenges are, so you can look at the list and be like, is that everything? Or I also really like the fact that just sort of like helps structure all the questions and steering. So
Yeah.
totally that approach resonates with me. And I found writing to be a really nice complement to that.
I agree. I do that too. I write notes.
Yes.
And and so you guys are all amazing female managers. Is there anything you had to unlearn to be a great manager as throughout your career? And this is for the whole group.
Yes, I can jump in. As a woman, person of color, coming from the Philippines, I grew up partly in the Philippines. I had to unlearn a lot of things in order to help grow my career. As a kid, and you can probably relate to a lot of these, I was raised to be quiet, take up the least amount of space, respect my elders, especially people of authority. So coming to the US, I think there was a certain level of inferiority complex ingrained in me. And I had to overcome and unlearn a lot of these things. I just needed to learn to speak up more, to take up more space or more than I would usually, and to question authority when needed, which is still hard for me even now. At my age, it's hard to question authority, but it's something that I have to really think about. Is this the time to question?
I identify as a little bit wild. I used to think that like process often was imposing on other people, and I had a lot of discomfort telling people what work they should do. So I just sort of started as free-for-all culture maker. But something that I've had to learn is just the ways in which process can be really kind and supportive for people and really let people thrive. And that's just totally turned me around. Now I'm obsessed with process while still having appreciation for fun chaos.
I actually those are great. And I have a totally opposite experience where I had to like unlearn being very like aggressive. So I think like I kind of got like a chip on my shoulder, like growing up and like nobody listening to me all the time. And then after a while I was like, whatever, you're going to listen to me. Like I'm going to go in there and tell everyone what to do. And then it was probably a bit exacerbated by my first job being in finance. And that's where I became a manager as well. So I learned a lot of behaviors of like people in finance and working. Also, it was a startup. So like a lot of yelling, a lot of like telling people exactly what to do and micromanagement. And then when I came to Etsy, I had to kind of unlearn a lot of that. And realized that I could just like be chill and be myself, and then like kind of leverage just like real human emotion instead of that very top down approach that I feel like I used to have. Yeah, thank you for the heart.
I really feel what Rachel was saying before about, yeah, I remember there were so many things where I'm like, we're not corporate, we don't need all this process. And then in time, I am now also a process addict. I think the biggest thing for me to unlearn was I always thought that before I became a manager, I always thought that I could never do it because I wouldn't feel productive. Like I have to be creating something. And if I'm not writing code, if I'm just spending my time in meetings, what am I doing? And then I understood that like my effect on other people and making them more productive would lead to, an amplified effect more than anything that I could write. So I like to say that I am like good at coding, but great with people. And I'm sort of like leaning into that as a manager, helped me figure out like how to redefine productivity.
So moving into mentorship, I think one of the challenges with mentorship is finding scalable ways to support a lot of the different people who are seeking your time and support without exhausting yourself. And so I know, Najla, you have a really unique approach to mentorship. Can you share?
Yes, and I actually give credit to someone else that I stole this from. So thank you, Gabby. I started kind of networking a lot more on LinkedIn lately, just to meet people and like kind of express myself and all that. And then a lot of people started reaching out and saying like, hey, can we talk? So what I did with that was actually set up like open office hours on LinkedIn. I just like put a Calendly invite, and I have open time for once a week, one meeting a week, where anyone can schedule time for me. And I've set up meetings now with people from all over the world, some more than once, and we talk about whatever they want. So that's been like really rewarding. And there are some days even where that one meeting a week is like too much, and I'm like, oh, I don't want to do it, but I still do it. So when that happens, I know that I'm doing the right thing. I'm like not overexerting myself, not like leaving it a free for all. So that's been really great. And then internally at work, figuring out like what is the minimum amount of time I need to spend with someone for us to like connect and get value out of each other has been important. So with some people it's like once a quarter, some people it's twice a year, some people it's once a month, but just really being intentional about the time I'm taking up from them as well.
Great. Rachel, you mentioned that peer mentorship has been especially helpful. And so can you say a little bit more about that?
I would love to. I found, especially as I sort of moved into taking on more ambiguous pieces of work, a lot of the challenge was even figuring out like, what problem am I solving? What are just the actual challenges to getting it done? It takes a lot more time to sort of figure that out, and just sort of a lot more kind of research. So I found that peers are people that tend to have similar amounts of time, tend to be sort of observing the same systems, the same challenges you do for work. And so I found it really rewarding to just sort of connect and sort of do that together. I found it just sort of in my early management career, I was very tempted to think of management as like art or like solo work because I was the only manager on my team. But the more I treat management work, like the sort of the advice I give ICs on doing technical work, the better. I think pairing is just such a valuable tool. And also, I don't know if you can tell, but I'm someone who likes to talk a lot. I do a lot of thinking through talking. And so it's just been really nice to find like riffing partners where I can just like say things and then see if they're true. And that's been great with peers.
So question for the group, what role, if any, does gender play in the success of mentorship? And did the gender of your mentor shape your experience in any specific way?
Personally, I've found, oh, sorry, Ivy,
Go ahead.
Personally, I found things correlated to gender, but not totally married to gender as something that was more important for me. I think I come across as someone touchy-feely, and I need someone to respect the fact that that also doesn't get in the way of sort of getting work done. In fact, is an asset, is an important tool. I'll say like one of my favorite peers, or someone I just learned a lot from, was a man who I worked with, who did things like would tell me, did you notice you were the only one? Like, did you also notice you were the only woman in that meeting? And so I could tell he was putting energy into noticing the effects of gender. He shared with me that he had a rule that for himself, he would only eat lunch at tables that were of mixed gender. And he shared that he had a hard time finding a place to eat a lot of times just sort of with engineers because of gender. And I find that just sort of people's familiarity and comfort talking about gender was a lot more important to me than actually the person's gender who I was trying to learn from.
Ivy, you were going to say something?
Oh, yeah, I was just going to say that I think when I started out I totally see what Rachel's saying. And when I started out in my career, there wasn't a lot of female mentors, I think, for me to look up to. So I ended up, you were talking about peer kind of mentorship. I ended up like seeking out the people that that had qualities that I admired, and kind of nurturing those friendships and kind of talking through. And it didn't matter what gender they were. It's more like, okay, this person, yes, she's strong, kind of like she's very outspoken. I like that. I want to learn more about that. Or this person, he gives really good feedback, like direct feedback. I really enjoy that. I want to learn how to do that. So I kind of go that way. And so I never really thought about gender or male mentorship or female mentorship. It's more about the qualities that I admired.
Great. So for those of you who do have mentors, how did you find them?
I do have a mentor, or I call her my mentor. I don't know if she knows that I'm her mentee, but I am.
I have the same thing.
yeah. Like we're tight. Yeah. She actually used to be my manager at Etsy, and she's now a VP of engineering, so pretty high up there. And when I first started reporting to her, it was my first time reporting to a woman and also a person of color. And I guess I hadn't realized like what I was missing my whole life, not having that. I'm also like Middle Eastern, like, so it's, it was like the first time I thought a manager like could kind of understood that side of my life. So after I stopped reporting to her, I decided to keep the relationship going. After, like, we took a long pause and like talking, and then I realized, oh, I don't have that anymore. So I basically reached out to her and just asked, like, can I keep talking to you? And like we picked some like cadence and then like regularly scheduled that thing. And then ever since then, I've just like every time I like admire someone, even if it is a peer, like set up like kind of those recurring meetings again, like even if it's only every 6 months, you kind of get to talk about your problems with them, and it's really helpful.
Great. Tal?
I don't have a specific mentor per se. I kind of follow what Ivy was saying about identifying different things in different people. And I think that, is it Najla or Nyla? It's Najla.
Yeah, it's Najla.
Okay, cool. So as she was saying, the like keeping in touch with someone even when they're not in an official capacity in your life anymore can be very powerful. And it's, as women, it's kind of hard for us to ask for someone else's time most of the time. So but I did have who was formerly a COO at Compass, Mile Gavet, which we were actually talking about earlier. She has been a very influential force in my life and just a great role model. So I managed to catch some time with her after she left us, which was great, because like even a 20-minute conversation with her was like life altering. So you need to find those people that like inspire you. And I also have an amazing male manager at work, at Compass, who has been, a very insightful source in my life and how to look at strategic planning from a higher perspective, because he's a VP and I'm not really exposed to the same things that he is. And I think that like they bring different things, Mile can sort of talk to being the woman leader in the room and what that means and how you're perceived and how you need to, sort of break those boundaries. And from the male perspective, you can sort of get in and maybe a more of an insight into what an experienced manager has to deal with without having to deal with the other stuff that a woman deals with. So it's really interesting to get a different spectrum.
Tal, what a small world that Mayel is one of my 20-minute calls as well every few months. So I think she's pretty amazing. Also, there needs to be more women leaders if you and I share a mentor. Great. Well, so moving into culture, and I think growing, the way more women leaders. So Rachel, you've said that a culture cannot remain good by itself. It takes tending to. And so what does this look like in practice?
Yeah, just companies are always changing. And so just even if you think you have your culture set up, it's not going to work in a little bit. And on top of that, I just think it's really changes a culture when it's sort of democratized, when everybody knows they have a part in shaping the culture. So for me, it's a really big deal for everyone in the company to be able to see how their feedback is connected to what's happening in practice. And so I think things like having really clear follow-ups from engagement surveys where people are just sort of like spilling their guts. After they do that, I think a company can sort of show that they actually have listened, synthesize that, and take actions from it. I also think there's a lot of how a culture makes space for rewarding people working in culture. So a great example of that, ERGs are often just sort of like the canaries in the coal mine. They're both fun. They serve deep purposes for individuals. But I think a lot of times groups of underrepresented people will also understand some of the challenges of working in the company and be best positioned to fix it. But I think it's also then really important to make sure that people are rewarded for engaging with ERGs, are rewarded for doing things outside of their day-to-day job for culture. So for example, as an engineer in an ERG, I want to see that on someone's just sort of formal feedback from their manager. I want to see people that get promoted to the next level based on their ERG work, even if they are a software engineer.
Great. So, there's going to be, I think, probably a lot of job changes in 2021. We've all been in our homes for a year. We're itching for change. Lots of people buying houses, moving, just moving in general. Tal, I know you recently moved. So how would you advise someone to evaluate the engineering team culture from the outside? So Ivy, you recently joined Maven during a pandemic, not having met a lot of people. So how, what were some of the questions that you were asking?
Yeah, my recommendation is to meet as many people as you can in the company. Ask them a lot of questions when you're interviewing. Make sure it's almost like they're interviewing you, but really you're interviewing them as well, because you want to know what the company's like, right? It needs to be like a two-way thing. That's how I always view it, like a two-way match. Sometimes you might have to read between the lines while you're asking questions and kind of hearing the answers. But that's how I've always done it. Like I try to meet as many people as I could, ICs, managers, like really maybe like cross-functional team members as well, to see what it's like to be working with other people. And if I have an in-person, like reach out to folks on the inside and ask them questions, because there might be things that you're not finding out in the interviews. Just learn as much as you can. That's how I do it.
Great. Anybody else?
I agree, Ivy. And I think that a question that can help you learn a lot is, what do you like about working there? It's pretty simple, but you can sort of build a pattern if you talk to a lot of people to see what type of thing people prioritize in the company. Because if they say, the comp and benefits are great, that's very different from them saying like, oh, I love my team or I love the people that I work with. It sort of shows you the priorities of the people that you're talking to. I think it's probably the best reflection when you can't like go and visit the office. It's tough. I mean, we've been discussing how to try to expose culture in, virtual interview settings. And we've considered, like, we used to have a lunch interview where someone would just have lunch and talk to a bunch of people at the lunch table. We don't have that anymore. So how do you replace that in a virtual setting? I don't think we've answered that yet.
Yeah, and I think to Rachel's point, like, you can't just like slap like a culture label on something and say like, this is our culture. Like, every person that you talk to is an opportunity to see how they carry out what they think the culture is, and like everyone's going to be a little different. It's like, for example, if you really care about like diversity and inclusion, like ask your like white male interviewer like what their part is in diversity and inclusion. Like, ask people who are maybe on the fringes of those types of real issues that we have in the world, and see how they're reacting to it in their company. And if they have a good story to tell, that's probably pretty telling, and if they don't, that might show you like where the burden lies for those kinds of things.
Totally. Yeah,
I've been asked, sorry, Rachel, I've been
ahead.
asked like point blank from women candidates if there are like, what is the women's situation like in the company? And I love that. And you should always ask that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love the things that sort of like pushes into the uncomfortable corners. Like, I like asking people, like potential future peers, how has your manager supported you? What are some specifics that they've done working with you? I think also just in a time where there's just so many national events going on, hearing like, how has your company addressed like just the fact that so many underrepresented employees are going through difficult times? For me, that's something that just sort of gives me a heads up that it's a company that will push into uncomfortable things that are happening, and it makes me feel like they will do it for me in my career.
I think it's a great segue into our next question, which is that, as we're talking about culture, we'd be remiss not to bring up intersectionality. And so how have you handled issues like racism within your teams?
It's been super hard this year. A lot of things have happened, have been happening for many years, right? But like, obviously we had a lot of things came up this year. I would say one mistake that I made was like waiting for an exact like script from like leadership. I think Etsy, for what it's worth, did a great job, but I realized that like I had to just step up, and like no matter how great of a statement like people make at the C-suite level, you need to like have that propagate down to every layer of management. So literally, like, especially when at the peak of George Floyd and Black Lives Matter back in like March or April, opening every meeting with like just asking people how they're feeling, people like letting people just cry, letting people just exist, and like even when realizing that like even when an issue isn't about like me, that like it comes back to like support. So like the anecdote I'll share is that we had so many of these conversations, and then later in the year in August, like I'm Lebanese, and we had a really terrible incident back home, and my team did the same thing for me. Like all my reports, they're like, "Hey, Najla, how are you feeling? What's going on? Let's talk about it." And I don't know, it showed me the value. And then again, like now with all these terrible things happening with Asian people in the US, again, we're just like reaping the rewards of the skills that we gained over the past year. So I think like, yeah, I think it's been hard, and I'm glad that it's a good question. I'm really interested to see how other people have dealt with it. But I think like what we're doing is learning skills to communicate with each other and to figure out how we can move forward together.
I agree. I mean, acknowledgement and vulnerability, I think, are the two main things. You have to bring it up, even though it's uncomfortable. As the leader, it's your role to put it out there so that people feel comfortable coming out and saying, yes, I'm having a very hard day. I don't know if I can concentrate today. And also, talking about your own feelings. I've had a manager that I work with open stand up and say like, this has been a very rough week for me. I've been talking to my therapist a lot. I've been working through some things. And I encourage you to take a day off if you needed a mental health day. So I thought that was really cool to put yourself out there and make sure that there's that safe space for other people.
Something that I thought was so lovely to get to see at Figma, we had an hour where everyone in the company was invited to sort of share reactions to the recent violence against Asian Americans. And I was just so deeply impressed with the personal amount of sharing that people did with just sort of their history of racism from a bunch of different races. I found every time I get to hear conversations like that, especially as a white person, I learned so much. And it is so clear to me how that's a valuable part of me growing into being a better community member. And that was also just something that just made me feel so safe as a queer too. I guess I had already mentioned that, but to see that level of sharing and support that people have for each other is really beautiful. So I think like, yeah, just asking people how they are is a great sort of micro space making. But I've also seen some patterns of just sort of like bigger conversations also having a lot of impact too.
Yeah, this is where I think the open door policy comes short for managers. You can't just say, I have an open door policy, come and talk to me. Sometimes you have to reach out and ask how they're doing. And I appreciated that. And I'm still trying to get better at that as a manager. But I think it's at Maven, at least, when all these things happen, especially with the attacks on Asian Americans, you know, people were very proactive about creating a space, right? A Slack channel where just everyone can share, or if people want to donate or, you know, do something more proactive, like we had a way to do that. Like people just really proactively did something so that we can have an outlet for these feelings that we're having that we may not always know how to express. And people reached out to me and asked me how I'm doing, which was really super nice and just super, yeah, just very, very heartwarming for me.
Well, thanks for sharing all of that. Next and final question before we move on to audience. What is just one specific piece of advice for the engineers on the line listening who want to grow in their career? So as an engineer, what would your one piece of advice be? So we can, we'll go around for this one. Rachel, we'll start with you.
Oh my gosh, I loved Najla's your manager doesn't care about you. I love memes that stick like that. That's going to be stuck in my head. But I think just taking your career as a project that you're driving, though, just sort of like figuring out like what are all the ingredients to this career? I need feedback, and just like really approaching that just sort of like as a project, showing your project management of like, here are my career goals. Basically, once you start creating your career as a fun, thriving project, I think it really draws other people in to get to help you and support you. So treat your career like work, and yeah.
Great. Najla?
Yeah, I think being intentional and making a plan is really important. So where do you want to go, and why do you want to get there, and does it align with your values? And it's really important, I think, to actually, in order to do that, I think we need to like look at how we got to where we are. Like actually, I do this exercise with myself. Like I write out like exactly like how did I get here, and then like a lot of times I start writing and I'm like, oh, there's a lot of things that I did here. Some intentional, some that were not intentional. Some things are just like kind of happened. You know, like you just graduate college, right? Like, or you get your first job. Like you don't really think like, what's my career going to be, right? But then like thinking, okay, like how can I use that as input to my next roadmap for my career, and like what can I actually do pretty intentionally, and then what am I not going to stress about also as I move through life a bit.
Great. Ivy?
I love what Najla said about looking back in your career, because if I look back in my career, I can say that where I've grown is what the times when I went out of my comfort zone. So that would be my advice. Go out of your comfort zone, because when you feel like, oh, I can't do that, especially as women, we always feel like, okay, we have to have 100% of these skills to whatever, to be a manager or to be a senior engineer or to be a staff engineer or whatever. you don't have to be, you could be at 60%, 70%. You'll learn the rest of the way there, you know, just get out of your comfort zone and jump on it, and you'll learn to grow.
Great. And tall.
I think that's so true. I'll build a little on what Rachel and Najla were saying and say that when you're planning for the future, you don't necessarily only have to look at your career as an engineer. It could be that like engineering is a stepping stone and you want something else for yourself. You could see yourself in tech in 20 years, or you could see yourself like starting an alpaca farm. You don't know. So you can still use the time you have now to build the skills that you need for whatever aspiration you have. This is also something I learned from Radical Candor. I did not make this up, but it's not so bad to talk about your manager about that kind of stuff and say like, hey, this is where I see myself in 20 years. What do you think I should be doing now in order to build towards that? And it's a win-win because the company is going to, benefit from your skills, and you will be more passionate because you're working towards something. But I did want to give another piece of advice, and that is know your worth. It's really hard for us as women to know, to give ourselves value and to be able to assess ourselves objectively, especially as women. I'm sure, other people have the same problem, but I think we were sort of raised to be more demure or modest. And sometimes when you're at a company, there's a chemistry thing. Sometimes it's just not the right fit for you, and it's not necessarily a reflection on your own abilities. So you have to be aware of yourself and know like, oh, I'm not a bad engineer. This is just not the right environment for me. Maybe I need to be looking elsewhere. So you always have to know that like, you need to know what you're capable of, and you need to know what you're worth, and not let the environment and other people affect that image you have in your head.
Great. All great advice. So we're going to move on to some audience questions. And one of them is all about New York versus San Francisco, which we were talking about on the before. So what to you is the difference between engineering culture in San Francisco versus New York? And so anyone who's worked in both places, I know some of you have, please feel free to jump in. Or have traveled between both a lot.
My previous company, the headquarters was in San Francisco. The company itself had a great culture within it, but what I heard from just talking to people who lived in San Francisco was that tech culture outside is a little bit different, right? Like, because there's not a lot of variety, so people are kind of off-put if they find out that you're in tech in San Francisco. I don't know if people have heard that. That's what I've heard anyway.
Yeah, I find like, I forget who was saying that in our pre-talk green room, but there's a lot more integration of tech into just all the other hustles that New York has. And I think that really shapes the sort of, thank you, Tal. It really shapes just like what it feels like to be an engineer in New York. I've also found that I think as a secondary consequence of that, just the engineering community in New York is so much more diverse, both in terms of gender, but I think also just in terms of international folks too. New York is just such a thriving, huge cosmopolitan city. It's fun to live in. But so I found that just even at a company that had offices in both cities, our New York office was significantly more diverse in terms of gender, internationality, interests.
Yeah, and I think like backgrounds too. There's a diversity of backgrounds. So I, work at at Compass, which is a real estate company. There's, I've been exposed to a whole industry that I was not familiar with, and also the people who ended up at Compass have come from like so many different backgrounds. Whereas before I was working at Microsoft, and everyone was just tech. So I find that really, interesting, invigorating, eye-opening.
But one other thing that I'll add, I think it's really interesting to see the sort of like trends in how companies are focused. San Francisco still, I think, has just generally more types of companies, but we've seen just like a lot of growth in terms of the types of companies in New York. For example, I love product engineering and making user-facing products, and there's been less of that in New York, but I'm definitely watching it pick up with excitement.
Great. And so we'll wrap up with one more question. So what do you consider to be the difference between mentorship and teaching? Anyone can jump in on this one. Najla?
I think mentorship has a teaching aspect to it. Generally, I think mentorship is like a mentor is someone you can go to for like a variety of topics and either like ask their advice on that topic, or you could be asking them, can you show me how to do this? Like they're like your go-to person to ask questions that could be teachable. So I think it's just one thing that may happen in a mentoring relationship. But that mentor, I think, can do so much more than that. So like you might just go to them, I'm in this situation, like what would you do if you were me? Like can you share more about like your part of the company? Can you share more about like this type of career path? It's a bit more conversational, and then that person can also advocate for you if they're in a position to do so. And that's something that I find really valuable in a mentor as well, that lies outside of teaching specifically.
Anyone else have anything to add on this point?
I would say, just off the top of my head, I think that if you ask a teacher a question, they would tell you the answer, but a mentor would ask you why you're asking the question. They give you like more context, maybe inspiration, maybe have you like step out of the situation you're in, go big picture. So
great. Well, so I think we can all agree that you four are fantastic. Thank you so much for coming and shedding light on a lot of the different things that I think everybody thinks about, whether you're an engineer or not, but specifically for a lot of the engineers listening today and female engineers on the line looking to grow their careers. So thank you again for all of your insights, and thank you to everybody who was listening, and have a wonderful day. I hope you left with a little bit of inspiration. I certainly have, and learning. And so, cheers to 2021. It's going to, the year's just getting better.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
absolutely.
See
Thank
y'all.
you so much. Thank you, Maven. This was
Bye,
really fun.
everyone. Thank you.